All right, everybody, let's get started. So I'm going to be talking about common accessibility mistakes and how to avoid them. So if that's not what you want to hear about, this is your fair warning. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So here's what I want to cover today. First, I'll introduce myself and tell you just a little bit about me. Then I want to cover a few principles that I use to build accessible websites. After that, I'm going to cover some accessibility mistakes that I have all made. I've made every single one, so mea culpa. And if time permits, we can have some questions and opinions. So first about me, that's me. I'm Ben Robertson. I live in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm a front-end developer at Media Current. Media Current, as you have probably heard today, maybe in another session, is a full-service digital agency that implements world-class open-source software development, design, and strategy to achieve defined goals for enterprise organizations seeking a better return on investment. I love working at Media Current. They let me come here, see all my friends. It's great to see my coworkers in person. I'm very excited to be here. This is my first Drupal camp and my first time speaking at Drupal camp, obviously. Although I've been involved with the Drupal community for about 3 years. I just celebrated my 3-year anniversary on Drupal. So I'm here to talk about accessibility because when I was first entering the front-end developer ranks, no one ever talked to me about accessibility. I didn't know you could break the law for having an inaccessible website, and I don't know if I would have become a web developer if I knew that. So we had a client at one point that came to me and they said, okay, hey guys, we need an accessibility audit, it's really important. And we were like, oh, what is that? But we did it, but I felt like I was really in over my head, and it was kind of scary to learn about that for the first time. And I found it was hard to learn about. So I feel like after I learned about it, it doesn't have to be hard, it doesn't have to be scary, but a lot of the writing out there is kind of like guilt-based and shame-based and fear-based and stuff. So I am here to share with you my homegrown web accessibility principles. So yes, trademark. So they're not rules, but what they are the mental shifts that I had to make when I first started developing accessible websites. So let's get into it. Principle 1. Web design is more than graphic design. So when I started my first web job, I used to be in advertising sales, that's where I started out, and then I transferred to the web, and it was super fun. But I started my first job, and I was with these designers, and they handed me a picture of a website, and they asked me to turn it into a website. And then after I did that, I thought, okay, that's great. Then they looked at my website, and then they meticulously compared it to their picture of a website and told me every mistake that I made. So there were things like the line height was 18 pixels instead of 16 pixels, or the gray is the wrong light gray, it should have been light gray, or the box shadow blur is off by a pixel, stuff like that. It was like so impressive that they could even see that stuff because I never saw it. But I learned a ton from those guys. But in those conversations, none of us really considered that the web is not as controlled as we want it to be. So we were so concerned with the visual elements of our work, but we didn't consider how the site might perform on a $99 Android phone on a 3G connection or a 2G connection, or for someone who was colorblind, or someone who couldn't see at all. And the fact that the web can be accessed by these people in those situations is what makes web design so much more than graphic design. And it's what makes web design fun, I think. It's such a powerful medium. So instead of focusing merely on visual elements, here's how I think about my work now. And here's what I wish someone explained to me from the beginning. So the 3 tasks of web design. The first is to write good markup. You start with good markup. So this means organizing the content on the page well, using HTML the way it was meant to be used. It's accessible by default, but we don't really always focus on that. So if we get this right from the beginning, all of our jobs are a lot easier. It's so much easier to make sure a site is accessible if it has good structure, good markup. And I'll spend a little bit more time on that later. The second task is to use CSS to enhance the excellent markup that we've obviously already written. So we've got some awesome markup, and then we're just going to enhance the qualities that it already has. So CSS should be used to emphasize the meaning of your content, and it should make it more meaningful, more impactful. But you've got to start with the right HTML to begin with, or else our jobs can be a lot harder, or some other dev's jobs can be a lot harder. And the third task is to layer the interactivity over the structure and the style with JavaScript. And I want to say about the difference between this approach and how I started. So the difference is that when I was first building websites, I'd look at the picture of a website and say, okay, I need some big text. So naturally, looking at HTML, H1, that's really big text. So I'll use that. That's the easiest thing to use because it's already big. Or like I have like this really complicated interface, so I'll just like I need a bunch of different things, so it'll just be a million divs, and that'll be great. It'll be really easy to style. So stuff like that. But all of that still only focused on the visual aspects, right? I was looking for the thing that would be the easiest to style or make the least amount of changes to. But to build accessible websites, we need to think about more than just how closely the site matches the picture. It's more than visual design or graphic design. That's why we call it web design. So that brings us to principle number 2. Be as semantic as possible, ASAP. So as semantic as possible. Here's how I recommend doing this, and this is what I do. Every time I start typing a div, I stop, I look in the mirror, and I ask myself. I have a mirror by my desk. So I ask myself, could I use a more semantic element? And that is it just helps you reframe. So you might wonder, how do you know if there's a more semantic element to use? Well, there's this great resource. It's called the Mozilla Development Network, and they have a page, and it's just a list of every HTML element, and it's organized by their purpose, and it has the element, and it has the purpose. And that, to me, that changed the world of HTML to me, because I didn't realize from the beginning that things just weren't just visual, but they were made for a reason, and so you can use them with that reason, and then it makes your job a lot easier. So that's just a short link that'll take you straight to that page, bit.ly/semantic HTML. So I've screen grabbed just a portion of it. So this is just the top part of the content sectioning section. So these are the different elements that you can use to break up your content, and so you have things like address, article, aside, footer, header, and when you might use them. This is really just like such an awesome reference, and I wish I found it a lot earlier. So these are a little bit bolder so you can see them. So here are some alternatives to divs, and also when you might use them. So if you have a part of your page that's a standalone section, instead of using a div, you can wrap it in a section tag, which I just like using it because oh, look at that section, look at that section. It feels more natural to me. If you have a blog, a news article, a forum post, or any kind of discrete piece of content that could be published, you can wrap it in an article tag. If you have several pieces of content that are the same kind of content and they're next to each other, you can make that a list. So you can make it an unordered list or an ordered list, and then when a screen reader is going through that, they'll actually hear, okay, blog post 1 of 3 as they're going through that, and they'll have more context. Do you have a top section of your page that maybe has something like a title and some metadata, or the author, or date posted? That's a perfect use case for a header. Do you have a bottom part of your page where there's some other data, like maybe some tags about your blog, or maybe some information about your site? That's a perfect use case for a footer. Do you have a sidebar? There's even an aside for that. And the most important one to me on this one is the button element. So if you have something that needs to be clickable, use a button. If it's something that's clickable and it's not a link, use a button, I should say. And I'll say it one more time. If it's something that's clickable on your page and it's not a link, you should probably use a button for that. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about that later. So just want to share that link one more time with you. There's that semantic HTML link. It's really awesome. So principle number 3, the website should look good naked. So what I mean by this is if you remove all the CSS from your page, your website should still be readable and usable. It should look good. So, and this is really the driving point of being as semantic as possible. So, or it's driving home the point of being as semantic as possible. So if you're being as semantic as possible, your website's going to look good without CSS. Because if your markup is semantic, then you're using elements that convey meaning. And that means that the browser is going to provide affordances for the meaning and or functionality of your markup. So that's why H1 is so big, is because it's supposed to be the main point of your page. That's why it's big. So what this comes down to is, I call it the naked test. So the naked test is a test of how semantic your markup is. Your markup should look like a well-structured outline like we used to make in school for research papers. So this is how you can check this. So this is JavaScript. You can take this code and pop it into your DevTools console. And what it's going to do is it's going to run through everything in the head of your document. And it's just going to, let's see, what am I so far away? Yeah, it's going to remove all the children in the head of your document. So that's where all your style sheets normally are loaded, is in the head of your document. If you're doing some kind of complicated JavaScript stuff, it might not work as well. But or if you're doing inline, like literally inlining styles or something like that, it might not work as well. But pop this in your console, all of a sudden you're going to see all the styles disappear. You can also use this as a bookmarklet, and that's what I do. And so you can like save it in the bookmarks tab of your browser, and then you can just click on it, and it'll take it right off. So if you want to know how to do that, there's a link to do that. That's really handy. So let's look at an example. This is the Google sign-up form. I think most people, if not everybody, is probably familiar with this form. So we've got a title, we've got the email input, and then we've got some buttons here. So we've got our forgot email button, create account button, and we've got next. We've also got a learn more link and some other text, and we've got some stuff down here as well. So what happens when we look at it naked? So here we go. So we still got the nice sign-in heading, right? And then with your Google account, and I think this is the email field. And forgot email, that was there. I don't know where these other inputs came from. We have this link. There's our next button and our create account button, but it's in this long list of things that also includes all the languages in the world. And I don't know if you noticed this, but actually, if you look back, next and create account have switched spots. So create account was first, and next has switched spots. And it's kind of confusing, like what label is what. So like you see the inputs there, but we're not exactly sure what's going on. So, all the content is still here, and you can tell that it's a sign-in page, so that's good. I'd say the main concern that I have with something like this is really the buttons not being buttons, because, when you look at it like this, there's no extra information that you might want to click on next, and it's not called out to you. They're not clear. And just because they're not using the HTML button element on here, it doesn't mean that this is inherently inaccessible. It's still possible to make something accessible if you're using a div or a span, or I think they were using a div or something. But it's a lot more work because you have to add all the JavaScript to handle that the browser already does. And for instance, what if the style sheet didn't load? Like this, it's just not that usable. So I would say you can think about that kind of stuff as maybe like how we think about code smells. So it's a sign that something might not be right. Now, I use this test is it's kind of a gut check for myself. So you can, like I'm saying, like you can fail the test, the naked test, and you can still have an accessible website even if you fail. But it's just harder, and just identifies the things that might go wrong for you to spend some more time on. So this is what I look for when I do it. First, I check to make sure the structure of the site makes sense. Are things in the right order? Does each section have a clear heading with the right level of heading tag? Does the content appear to be organized in some way? Can I skim the page and get an idea of the content as if I were skimming an outline? So do the main points of the page kind of stand out to me, and then I can dive in more later. Next, as I did on that last page, I look to see if the interactive elements appear to be interactive. So if I've created a bunch of interactive elements using divs, they're not going to look interactive once I remove the styles. So if I know that something's interactive and then it doesn't look interactive later, I can then spend a little bit more time on that, making sure that it really is going to be accessible, making sure it's going to work with keyboards and screeners and all that kind of stuff. And then the other thing is I always want to check to make sure my inputs have labels, because forms are the main thing that people are really, it's really the main thing that people are interacting with on your site, and without a label, it's basically unusable. So that about sums up the naked test. Now, my fourth principle is, this is the last one, so I've got four homegrown principles. So this is my last principle, and then we'll get into the mistakes. Talk to your computer. So, you can talk out loud to your computer if you want to, especially if you work from home. That usually works pretty well. But what I mean here is to communicate with your computer. So give the browser some context, and we can do this in HTML using ARIA attributes. And what ARIA attributes are, ARIA stands for the Accessible Rich Internet Applications. So this is a standard or spec come out from the web community to kind of increase the accessibility of our applications. There's ARIA states, there's ARIA roles, and there's ARIA properties that you can use to tell the browser certain things about your web page if you choose to use them. So they provide just extra context to users behind the scenes. They're not going to show up on your page. You're never going to see an ARIA label. You're not going to see an aria-expanded unless you're using a screen reader and it's interpreting that for you. But just it's more of a behind the scenes thing. So here are some examples. So a really common one is an ARIA label, and it's an attribute that you can add on any element to just provide some extra details about what that element is. So where I use this a lot is on links, so especially like a read more link or something like that. If you have a bunch of read more links, they just say read more. It's not necessarily clear where that's going to, so you can just go ahead and add some extra data in there that says read more about whatever the title of that article is. That's where I use it a lot. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. The aria-expanded attribute tells the user whether an element is open or closed, if it's expanded or collapsed. So it just takes a true or false value. Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. I'm busy typing. Will you explain the sentence for me? What element describes this element?
Yep, I'll get to that.
Thank you.
Yep. So the aria-expanded, so it's whether something's open and closed. So if you have a button that opens something else, you can add the aria-expanded value, and it'll tell the screen reader whether that button has opened something else or not. It makes it really easy for people to know that button is going to do something. The aria describe by attribute, so what this does, I have here what element describes this element. So the common use case that I would use this for is if you have an input and then you're going to display some error text with that input. So you would put aria describe by on the input, and you would point to the error text with that input, for that input. And so basically what it tells it says, okay, the browser says, okay, look, I have this input, and it's got aria describe by, and it has an ID of some other element on the page. So let me go see what that element of the page is and the content of that, and then I'll read that when I get to this element. So it lets you provide extra data, extra description on that element.
Thank you, that's very clear.
Yep, awesome. And then the last one I have here, there's lots of others. The spec is really big, but these are the most common ones that I use. Aria Live. Basically, you would use this on some region of your page that's going to be updated. So you might do this like on a views exposed filter or something like that. And it basically, if you put it on the page, it'll tell the browser that this element or this section is going to be updated later. And then when it is updated, the browser will read that out loud to the user. So it'll tell them that section has changed and what has changed about it. So that one is really handy with any kind of AJAX or dynamic content. So, but what you're doing with all these things is you're giving the browser extra context so it can have a better idea of what functionality a certain element has, and more context to users of screen readers and other assistive technologies. You're kind of just telling like the browser like what's going on, because it might not really know what's going on. There's so many ways of doing things with JavaScript and HTML that you're just saying like giving it some hints about what you're doing. That's why you're talking to it. So that writes up the 4 principles. So just to recap, principle 1 is that web design is more than graphic design. Principle 2 is to be as semantic as possible. Principle 3 is that all our websites should look good naked. And principle 4 is to talk to your computer. This is your website should appear naked. This is really fun to just go around and look at other people's websites without their CSS. I always find it really interesting to see what's going on behind the scenes. So, and it's a fun little trick. So now we will get into some common accessibility mistakes. And like I mentioned earlier, these are all mistakes that I have personally made. I've made every single one of them multiple times. And that's how you get better, is you learn from your mistakes. So we'll start with an easy one. Missing a title. This one seems pretty obvious, but it's not always obvious. So every web page needs a title tag. So I have an example of title tag right there, right? So it's title, page title, and it's the title of your page. And that goes in the head of your document. And the title tag, how we see that is in the browser tab. So the text that you see in your browser tab that's directly from the title tag in your markup. For screen reader users, the title tag is also the first thing that's read out loud to them when the page is refreshed or when the page is loaded. So it tells people what page they're on, what content to expect. So for this reason, the title needs to be informative. It should tell them what they should expect on the page. It also needs to be unique. So I'd say unique is probably the harder and more important thing to focus on. So imagine, just if you're using the web normally and you're opening a ton of tabs, and imagine if every single tab, like you're doing research on something and you're on the site and you're opening up all these different articles, but every tab has the same title of blog name. Well, when you want to go find that one page that you opened up that had that specific piece of information on it, you're not going to be able to find it because you're going to have to go through every single tab to figure out what that was if they all have the same title. So to avoid this, the most common mistake that I see with this is like when a CMS like Drupal or WordPress, we often have the ability to set like a fallback title or a default title, and sometimes that gets set as like a brand name or a company name. And it may seem like a reasonable fallback in case there's nothing else there, but it can be so confusing to just land on a page that just says, whatever, mediacurrent.com, mediacurrent.com, confusing. So here's another example. Now, imagine you're blind, you're using a screen reader, so you're on a page, you can't see the page is being read to you by your computer. The title of the page that you're on is enrollment form. So you got a form and you're going through it and you're filling out all these form fields, all this information about you and your family maybe, and then you hit a button that says next. And then the next thing you hear is enrollment form. So you start to wonder, did I click the wrong button? Did I leave something blank? Did all my information get lost? I just spent a lot of time filling that out. It can be confusing, disorienting, frustrating. Even when you can see a form, it's frustrating when the page reloads or you don't know. It's so frustrating to lose your form data. So that's a really good example of when unique titles are important. Is maybe you have a multi-step form, and it's a great use case for a title. So what you can do in a situation like that is on the first page of your form, you can say form step 1. So the first page you can say for your title, you might make it something like enrollment form, step 1 of 4, and then say family member, so it's the information about your family members. And then when they hit the next button, the title would be enrollment form, step 2 of 4. And so you kind of go through this and you let people know how far along they are, where they're going, and they know right away that that's happening and what's going on. So that's just an example. But just try to make sure that every page has a unique, informative title. All right, the next one is along a similar vein. So it's having a poor heading structure. So this comes from misusing heading tags like H1s, H2s, H3s, all the way on down to H6. So, and like I mentioned earlier, this comes from just not understanding the purpose of these tags. So heading tags are really used to form the outline of a web page. They're actually one of the main things that help your site look great naked too. So in addition, they can be a way that screen readers let you navigate the page. So if you open up your screen reader that's in Mac OS X, there's actually a menu that just it shows you all the titles on a page and lets you just skip to whatever title you want to. That's a really cool feature on screen readers that I use sometimes even when I'm looking at a web page. So I mentioned this earlier, but when I was first building websites and I needed large text, I would use an H1 because they're already large. I'm lazy and it's less work for me. But I would do this for large statistic callouts. So like we might have something like a banner and it would say, 90% better than our competitor. And I'd stick 90% in an H1 because that was supposed to be the really big text, and then better than our competitor would be in a paragraph tag or something like that. So I styled it with CSS and it looked fine. But when you perform the naked test on it or you use a screen reader, all of a sudden your attention is drawn to these meaningless numbers. So the page starts looking, or it starts being read like 90%, 200, 1/3. And there's no context. So it doesn't, those kinds of things are supposed to organize the content, and I was almost, I was flipping what the purpose was of it. So that's what heading tags for. They're for clearly organizing your content. Now every page should have an H1. That's an accessibility best practice. It's an SEO best practice. And the H1 is usually pretty easy. It can just be identical to your page title that we talked about last time. It should describe the main content or purpose of the page. And then most pages also have enough content to break the page up into different sections. So then below your H1, you have all these different sections, and each section should then have an H2 to kind of describe what's going on in that section. If there are different sections inside of those sections, then you use an H3, and then inside of your H3, you can use H4, so on and so forth. It really helps the readability of the site, and it's really important to not skip down into a lower one. So if you have an H1 and you want to use an H3, there should be an H2 in between there. That's why they're numbered, so you go in order. So that's a good tip, to follow the numbers. So a place where I'm always thankful for this, the really good heading structure, is on Wikipedia. So I know we've all been there, right? You're Googling some obscure fact, and you end up on this really long Wikipedia page, and you're like scrolling, where is it? And but thankfully, Wikipedia has these really great heading tags. Look at this H2, etymology, characteristics. Oh, underneath characteristics we have structure. So this, and it just really helps you scroll to exactly the information that you're looking for. I always find that to be really helpful. Same thing on long blog posts. I mean, a lot of times you're Googling as a web developer and you just want to find this one little piece of information, but it's buried in a 5,000 word blog post, and heading tags really make it easier to find that information. So, all right, common mistake number 3 is read more links. I kind of touched on this earlier. This often happens on a blog or a homepage where you have a teaser, you show a list of content or something like that. So you have a title, image, teaser paragraph, and the ever popular read more button. So I just want to touch on the problem with buttons like read more or click here. And the problem is that the link title doesn't give very much context on where the link is going to take you. So there's surrounding context, but the link itself doesn't have the context. And so you end up thinking like, read more what? Read more where? What's going to happen if I click on this link? What's going to happen to me? So link text should be informative, and it should be able to stand on its own without the context of what is around it. So similar to the heading navigator that we talked about in screen readers also have you can just open up a list of all links on the page. Even without a screen reader, I mean, when you're just hitting the tab key, you're going through everything that's focusable on the page, which is all links. That's how a lot of people that are using their keyboard are navigating, and so it's really important to have good context around those links. So visually, the links may make sense, right? It may be very obvious that there's a title and an image, and it's all about that same thing. But like we talked about earlier, web design is more than just visual design. So not everybody's going to be looking at the website. And the examples, like I said, and when you end up with a list of teasers like that, some people might be hitting tab, and what they're hearing is read more, read more, read more, click here, read more, and they have no idea. Anyways, it's a bad experience. So some people say you should never use read more buttons. I don't think that matters. I think you can use read more buttons, but it's just some people like to argue about stuff. So just a few people. But the trick to solve this problem is to use hidden text. So Drupal has something built in, if you're familiar with Drupal, you know, like we are. There's the visually hidden class that you can use. What that does is that basically like positions some content in a certain way that makes it hidden but still available to screen readers. The only problem with using that is like actually the screen reader on Mac OS X, it misorders the content. So like if you did something like this using that, read more about title, how it would read that would be title, read more about. And so it kind of gets confusing. So the way that I recommend solving this is using ARIA label, like we talked about. And you just stick the ARIA label right on the link, and then instead of reading the link text that you would normally have, a screen reader is going to read actually it's going to replace that with the ARIA label. So you can read more about title. You can put whatever you want there, but putting something interesting is probably the best bet. So that's going to make your links have more context and be more informative for people. All right, mistake number 4, not including a label with an input. So I mentioned this earlier. The most common way that I see this happening is designers love to use the placeholder attribute. I won't say every designer, but most designers I've worked with love placeholders. Obviously it's common, Google uses it, so like, you know, like that's the pattern where you have some text inside the input instead of text outside the input. The problem with this comes when like there's a placeholder attribute that gets used instead of an actual label, because browsers have built-in affordances around the label tag. So when a label and input are properly associated, either by wrapping the input in the label or using the for attribute on the body, on the label, clicking on the label will actually focus the input. That's really helpful for checkboxes. It's really helpful for people with fat fingers. It's really helpful for people who just are bad at aiming, and it's helpful. I think it's helpful for everybody. I find it very helpful. Second thing about labels is they persist when you're entering data. So if you're using a placeholder attribute, and as soon as you type a character in there, your placeholder is gone. It's replaced with your data. And it can be easy to forget what format was that date supposed to be in. Am I supposed to include the dashes with my phone number? That kind of stuff. It's just confusing. And then third, labels are a lot easier to style than placeholders. You sometimes have to use some weird vendor prefixes when you're trying to style placeholders. But labels, you can move them, you can animate them, you can change their size easily, you can adjust the contrast easily. They're just a lot easier to work with, and everybody likes them better. So there's that. It's possible to achieve this pattern using a label and do it accessibly. So just because something looks like this doesn't mean it's not accessible. So what that's called is called it's often referred to as the float label pattern. So I have a link there to a CSS Tricks article that will show you how to do that. The gist of it is basically you do your label, or you do your input, and then the label goes directly underneath your input, and then you style the label conditionally depending on whether the input is in focus or not. But the main point is that every input needs a label. You associate it either by using the for attribute or actually just sticking the input inside of the label. So it's easy, but it's also easy to forget about. All right. I said we would talk about CSS Grid and Flexbox because that's the cool thing. So this isn't so much a common mistake, but it's something to keep in mind as everybody's moving more towards these layouts. So I love Flexbox, everybody loves Flexbox, and we're probably reading a new article about CSS Grid every single day, right? So they're both awesome and they're powerful tools, but as is the case with most powerful tools, they can cause accessibility problems when we use them improperly. So one of the powerful parts of this is there's an order attribute, and it's part of Flexbox and it's part of CSS Grid. And what the order attribute lets you do is it lets you manually reorder the content inside of a grid layout or a flex layout. So all items inside of a grid or inside of flex have an order attribute of 0. If you set it to -1, it doesn't matter where that item is. If you have this grid, it's going to automatically go to the first spot. That's what -1 does. Automatically goes to the first spot. If you set it to any other number, it's just going to go to that place. So if you have 10 items and you set one of the items to order 5, it's going to go to the 5th spot. So it's pretty cool, it's very powerful, it sounds really handy. The problem with it is that it only visually reorders the content. It's not actually changing the order of your HTML. It's not changing the logical order of anything. So when a user is like using your site, if you start hitting the tab key, the tab order is going to be the old order. It's not going to be the new flex order that you set. So what's going to happen is if you've reordered something, you're tabbing through the page, all of a sudden your tab focus is going to jump down here, it's going to go over here, it's going to go over there. It's not going to go in order. And then if you're using a screen reader, it's going to be also doing the same thing. It gets confusing. So the key point to remember with this is visual order versus logical order. So it's okay to use the order property if you're only doing visual reordering. So that'd be something like you might have like a very design heavy grid that maybe has some just kind of visual elements that are moved around with grid, and you can move those around. But anything that has content in it, anything that has text that's going to be read, that's important for the site, if you're reordering that and you're trying to put it in a different order so that people read in a different order or access it in a different order, that's when you would actually need to go back and change your markup instead of using CSS. So when you need to change the order of your content, change your markup, not your CSS, even though it's so easy and so nice. This is also something, we actually saw this in the naked test on the Google form, is the next and create account button switch places. I'm not sure if that's how they were doing it, but that's something that you can catch in your naked test. Is like you'll actually see that the content on your page has changed. All right. Number 6, images and all attributes. So we discussed how web design is more than just visual, but what do you do with something that's very visual like an image? Well, that is the main purpose of the all attribute on image tags. So what the all attribute is, it's a text alternative to the image in the event that someone is unable to see the image. So that's alternative, that's where it comes from. This may happen, so someone might not be able to see the image for a variety of reasons. It's not just because they're blind, right? You might have typed the image link wrong. Their internet might be broken. Your server might be broken. The internet might be slow, or they might be using a screen reader. You might have also included a 16 megabyte image that's just taking too long to load. That happens. That sometimes happens. So you should always use the all attribute. So what that does is it provides, if the image hasn't loaded yet, it'll just show some text that describes what that image is. If the image never loads, that text is just going to be there so people can see it. If you don't include an all attribute on an image, screen readers are going to read the file name of your image. And I can't think of anything worse than that, because have you looked at file names of images lately? I mean, imagine going through a page and hearing 201.018 ACN 300 by 400 by .jpeg like over and over and over again. So don't do that to people. So always include the all attribute, but you don't always need to put anything in the all attribute. So it can be empty. If an all attribute is empty, the screen reader is going to skip this image entirely. It's going to think it's decorative content. So it's going to say it's not content, it's not important for understanding the content or functionality, and it can be skipped. So you might do this in a situation like this. So here I have a card. It's all about me. So there's a title that's my name, Ben Robertson, an image with all text of Ben Robertson. It's a picture of me being handsome. And it's got text about me. I'm a friend of developer media current. It's got a link to me, right? So if the screen reader reads this image, it's going to come, it's going to say, heading 2, Ben Robertson, graphic, Ben Robertson. Ben Robertson is a front-end developer media current. So it's going to read my name 3 times in a row. And unless there's like something in the image that's very important to convey, like Ben Robertson standing on a horse, maybe, like that might be interesting. Like there's some detail that's very important to the content. This would be a really good situation where you don't even need to, you can just leave that alt text blank because they know that it's a card that's about me. That's a really good example that I recently came across. Another example is like a closed menu button. So here, like you might have a hamburger menu, you have a button. It's an image icon that says closed menu, the alt text is closed menu, and then this text here, closed menu, either that's displayed or maybe it's visually hidden. In either case, you can just leave this off. Otherwise, this button is going to be closed menu button. So it's duplicated. It's not necessary. So those are two examples where you would leave the alt attribute on there. You just get rid of that stuff and then it'll just leave it by themselves. That's how you solve that. All right. Always include the alt attribute, leave it blank sometimes. Let's move into some keyboard stuff. So focus, outline, none. Maybe you've seen this in CSS before. This became really popular because it was included in a lot of CSS resets, like normalized CSS, that kind of stuff. And what it does is the browser provides little focus rings around different content when the keyboard when that element is in keyboard focus. So if you're hitting the tab key, and this CSS was provided by resets so that we could make that consistent. So it removes the default styles, and then you're supposed to add some really beautiful default styles for yourself. But people forgot to add the beautiful default styles. So the default outline is there to comply with the standard requirement, which says that any keyboard operable user interface should have a mode of operation where the keyboard focus is indicator visible. So when you're using a mouse, it's very obvious where your mouse is, right? But when you're using the keyboard, it's not, if there's no indicator on screen, then you don't know where you are. So that's what this is for. It's the alternative to the mouse. So I will say that I've gotten a lot of feedback from designers on focus styles that they don't like them. They don't think they're pretty. They think they're ugly. Where did this come from? I didn't design it. And so out of this conversation, someone said to me, they're like, well, if it's just for keyboard users, can we just do it when people use their keyboard and not with their mouse? And the answer is yes. That was a really good question. I'm so glad my designer asked that. I have a link here to some information about the focus visible CSS4 selector. It's coming. It'll be here soon. Well, I don't know how soon, you never know. But there's a really good polyfill for it that you can use. It's really easy to implement. And basically, it provides a class depending on whether you're using your keyboard or your mouse. So you can just style the focus ring. It won't show up for people that are using a mouse, but it will show up for people that are using the keyboard. All right, missing keyboard function. Let's see if I can get through this. So it's really important to make sure that anything you can do with a mouse, you can do with the keyboard. So anytime you're binding a click event to something, you should also be binding a key up or key down event to that thing. If there's a button that opens the main navigation like we've seen, or close the main navigation, you should be able to use the enter or space bar to also trigger that click. Now, the easiest way to do that is always use the button element. That's why I said that earlier. When you use the button element, if you bind a click event to a button element, it's gonna bind actually the click element and then also the enter and the space bar for you. It just does it automatically. It's so much easier. You're gonna write a little bit extra CSS to style your button better, but you're gonna write less JavaScript. It makes it a lot easier. The other things you might need to do, there's other examples. So you might also need to provide keyboard functionality for exiting a component, closing something, submitting something, moving position, browsing. And the most common key codes that I use for that, so that's what you do when you're using JavaScript to do key codes. There's a site, Flexbox, and you type a key and tell you what the key code is. So basically, you just, on your event.keycode, you can say, okay, is this the escape key? If yes, escape. If it's the arrow key, move up. If it's the arrow down key, move down. If it's enter key, so this is a really nice little handler that I use a lot for providing logic in my JavaScript for that. Just need to make sure that functionality matches across mouse functionality and keyboard functionality. You should be able to use your whole site with just your keyboard. All right, the last tip that we'll talk about is hiding things. So there's so many ways to hide things. You can hide things with display none. You can z-index them behind everything else. You can move them off screen. You can make them transparent. You can make them so tiny that they don't even exist. So many ways. It's so fun to hide things, but the important thing to keep in mind is if you're hiding something, the screen reader needs to know that's being hidden. So the way that you would normally do that is with display none. So display none is going to make sure it's going to take it out of the visual hierarchy and the tab index and the source order, so like they won't even know that it's there, or the HTML hidden attribute, which does the same thing. If you need to use another CSS way to hide something, which we often do when we're animating something, then we use the ARIA hidden attribute, which I don't think I included on that earlier slide with the ARIA labels. but aria hidden equals true will make sure that the screen reader doesn't know that's there. So if you have a navigation that's off screen and you're tabbing through and it doesn't have aria hidden equals true, their tab focus is going to end up off screen. It's going to be really confusing. So you just need to toggle this value with JavaScript, which you do like same. So this is aria-expanded. So but you can do the same thing with aria. You just set the attribute to false. And we kind of already touched on aria-expanded, and we're right at 3:45. So we'll wrap it up there. Does anybody have any questions?
Are you going to post your slide deck?
I will post my slide deck. Yep.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So we're producing a scientific report in PDF and web, and we're having an alt text crisis because the PDFs can only have the alt tag, but on web we can do a longer, with the description tag, we can do a longer one for these crazy figures that show graphs with like 4 panels. And how long can we want to get away with just having someone generate alt text once instead of generating like a long description and then a small alt text with like 3 words? How long can alt text be? What can we get away with? Or should we end up doing both?
So I don't know if there's like, maybe someone else knows if there's an actual limit on how many characters you can stick in there.
Yeah.
I would try to keep it like a sentence or 2 in there, just because like people aren't going to be able to navigate through that content when it's being read. You know, like you can navigate between. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You can like if it's normal text, you can like skip to the next word or go up back and forth between sentences, but it's not. It's going to be difficult to navigate. So.
Yeah.
PDFs are a pain.
Yeah.
You'll notice I didn't talk about PDFs at all.
Yeah, yeah. So it'll probably get unwieldy the longer it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
What tool do you use to check for accessibility?
So I use the naked test. I also I use the Wave browser extension a lot just to see things. Yeah, I have like a kind of, I mean, I have the stuff that I put here. I also have just kind of like a little list that I just kind of go through to check something. If somebody needs like a really intense audit, you know, there's tools like Tenon, which is a paid scanner. For me, I feel like those things can help identify issues, but I always have to end up going back and checking over them anyways, because it's like, well, maybe that was okay in context, or maybe it wasn't a really issue.
We're using site improvement every too.
Site
Go through
improvement.
our site.
Okay.
It's real intense.
Yeah. Is that what, do we use that on Guardian, or?
I don't know,
what they use.
something else, like
Yeah.
core or something?
Site core.
I don't know.
Site
This
improvement.
checks for, accessibility, does other things. It checks all PDFs, does quality assurance, for broken links, misspellings, does SEO, does other things, goes through all the PDFs, make sure all of those are accessible.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll check that out.
Really good. Chrome has an extension you can use for it, but
With
we
Site
just
Improve.
cover-
Yeah, I guess the other one that I use is the Axe Chrome extension, and the Axe, they have a command line interface. I think we have some for some projects we've set up as a command line interface that will actually run on every deployment to do some accessibility checking like that.
On our site there at WTech, we got so many section editors, for each department and stuff, and they're always, we're continuing to add content, taking out content. So we have to constantly keep a
Yeah.
check on, and does a report every day.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it's definitely good to have something like that to double check. Yeah.
Actually, to answer that earlier question, technically, an alt tag has no official limit. JAWS, however, does put a cap at 125 characters. And then it's going to splitting that out into additional chunks of 125 characters, which can in itself cause an accessibility issue.
Okay.
That's really good to know. I didn't know that.
Yeah. 125.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Kind of an obvious tip, it's sort of a low rent naked test when I'm working with clients and I need them to see why they shouldn't do something, is just send them to the Google cache of the site in question where they've searched something up and done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
It's
good
the easiest way to-
think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever, like, you know, view your site with a screen reader, or read your site with a screen reader with correct
Yeah.
purpose? 'Cause
Yeah.
it's something I feel like a lot of us read about how screen readers work, but don't actually take the time to.
So yeah,
experience
if you really wanna,
Yeah.
if you really wanna do the accessibility thing, like that's the best way to actually use your site, how someone would use it, so.
Uh-huh.
I mean, like Mac OS has one built in, JAWS is pretty expensive, but there's NVDA for Windows, that's free. I really recommend doing it, you can, I think it's fun to use. There's the built-in navigation that I talked about, I think JAWS has one that's similar to that. It's actually like, I wish that the web just had that built in, like for everybody to just like build, you can, one of the cool things I didn't mention, you can use landmarks, so like when you have a header or a main or a side or section, those screen readers, they'll actually let you jump to those sections so you can do that kind of stuff, and I really like that. So.
Have you come across one for Linux that works decently? No?
I don't know.
Like, you know that there isn't one, or you just don't know?
I just don't know.
Okay.
Does anybody? Cool. Well,